arrived during our break. Just a reminder that we have 10 minutes per submitter, including questions from counsellors, and there will be a bell at 5 minutes and then at the end of 10 minutes. And to kick us off after our morning tea break, we have Maxine Bogue. Welcome, Maxine.
Kia ora. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Can you hear that all right?
Perhaps, can everyone hear that okay? Little bit soft.
Okay. Councillors and Mayor Wise, at the council meeting on the 3rd of December, you decided to send out a draft policy that was little changed from the status quo, just dropping the cap of machines from 320 to 298. You were aware that this was not what the Māori Consultative Committee or the Māori Committee wanted, or what some of us wanted, a minority of us wanted, but you said you wanted to hear what the community said. Well, the community has spoken in 104 written submissions, and today presentations from 24 of them. Of those 104, 11 are from the industry and 93 are from the community or community groups. And as you will have seen, the vast majority of the submitters do not support Council's proposal, or if they do, that it didn't go far enough. One submitter even said that your current policy, quote, is a weak public health harm minimisation policy which prioritises hospitality before health. I spent hours over the weekend going through each submission. I said it's 104 rather than 105 because Soraya Longtime's submission was recorded twice, and what she said she did was she made her submission, she told me, she pushed the button, it vanished, and she heard nothing back. So she was quite worried, and so she wrote it again. So that's why there are two versions of her submission. I took note of whether each submitter wanted more or fewer restrictions on gaming machines in Napier, or the status quo. From those numbers, 87 want tighter regulations than your proposal, 87 out of 104. 61 out of 87 support a sinking lid and relocation merger ban. 9 out of the 87 support just a sinking lid policy. 15 of the 87 propose other restrictions to reduce harm from pokies, such as shorter hours and things that are beyond the control of councils. 24 submitters said yes to your proposal, but 15 added further restrictions such as the sinking lid. And I think what happened with some of them was that they wanted the sinking lid and the ban on relocations, but they thought, well, if we first lower the cap, then the sinking lid and the ban of relocations will be from this lower number. So that's what I understood happened with quite a few of them. There were 2 yeses from the gaming industry that they liked the proposal, and 9 didn't like it because they wanted further loosening of the restrictions. Overall, 87 submitters, as I say, want tighter regulations than your reduced cap. This is an overwhelming response. The last time we went out for a review, we got 11 submissions. This is almost 10 times as many. Hastings, in their last year's review, got 41. So I know that 36 were done on a template, but 8 of those 36 are presenting in person to you today. That's more than the number presenting from the industry. So these submitters are basically in 2 groups. The industry, who supports the proposal or supports further, less restrictive changes, and the community, who overwhelmingly rejects the cap proposal outright and wants a sinking lid and no relocations. So of the 24 oral submitters who will speak today, 5 are from the industry, wanting as little regulation as possible. 19 are from the community, all wanting more regulation than your proposal. What's really weird is that no one made a submission from any of the groups that are the recipients of any gaming trusts. So that was interesting. They're certainly not speaking to us. So we were led to believe the sky would fall in if you'd adopted a sinking lid policy, which hasn't happened in other cities, yet none of the affected parties actually submitted. So which community groups submitted? Napier Grey Power, Taradale Senior Sits, DHB, the Napier Baptist Church, Piramai Baptist Church, Māori health provider Hapai Te Hauora, Safer Napier Group, plus the 2 problem gambling organisations. They all want the sinking lid and no relocations. Never before in these reviews have Grey Power or the senior sector submitted on these that I know of. But they are concerned. I know they're concerned about the number of pokies machines that there are in Taradale in particular, where there's a lot of vulnerable older people living, and they're surrounded by this opportunity in that particular area. So these community groups represent a spectrum of community and health groups who focus on well-being. So which groups did not submit? Not one of the community groups the gaming industry gives money to. None of them felt strongly enough to make a submission to support the policy, which the industry tells us their grants are dependent on. So that's a whole other sector of the community, a positive part we all value, the sports groups, the social groups, the arts sector, social services. They did not submit for reducing regulation. But of course they can't submit against it because, as Mark Cleary said in his submission, quote, trustees and groups are overly cautious on speaking out for fear that their organisations that they belong to will miss out on future funding, or they get blacklisted like I have been. So where to from here? You asked and you have been told your community wants more restrictions on gambling venues because of the harm they cause. A sinking lid and no relocation or mergers are what most want. And as one submitter said, now's the opportunity to lead the country in this area. Make Napier a better city. Look at the damage it does. Now you have the chance to end it. What do your officers recommend? They recommend, quote, councillors consider all of the submissions and either adopt the policy as proposed or choose to amend the policy as a result of the submissions, end quote. Or as I see it, you can either go along with what the hospitality and the gaming industry is endorsing, I think they'd settle with your current proposal, or you amend the proposal to make the changes that the community has asked for. Right, there were a couple of other things that I did ask in my submission for you to consider, and one is for you to lobby the government to produce a budget and a timeline for phasing out gaming grants with government-funded grants to wean the community off grants from pokies. As a local council, you can approach the government, perhaps through the Local Government New Zealand, to ask that they do their bit by providing their own grants to replace gaming grants. I'd also like you to ask the Minister of Internal Affairs to do a thorough review of gambling trusts who have no transparency on criteria on who is given grants and who is blacklisted. The allocation of gaming funds through the trusts is shrouded in secrecy, enabling these trusts to give grants to whoever they like and decline others, especially if they have a board member who has spoken out against gambling harm. The industry needs to be carefully scrutinised as the power they hold over community groups can muzzle them in order to get funds. Should council support gambling? And this is what one of the submitters said. I do not think the council should be supporting gambling in any way. Council applies to gaming trusts every year. I'm not quite sure what the exact figure is, maybe 60,000 last year, I think I heard. Problem gamblers contribute to this, 30 to 60% of the money paid in grants. Is it ethically right for us to take funds from grants which come from low-income households who cannot afford to lose to pokies? There's only 2 levers councils can use to help reduce gambling harm. One is to use this review process to place restrictions on venues such as the sinking lid and not allow relocations. The other is to decide not to take money from gaming trusts. Our present practice of using gaming trust funds is not in keeping with our Safer Napier responsibilities and our commitment to the well-being of our community. I think the time is right for us to lead the way in this. Just by means of contextual information, you will hear more of this from other submitters such as the DHB, whose submission focuses on the harm done to our most vulnerable community members by pokies gambling in particular. So there you have it. Māori are 5 times more likely to develop problem gambling behaviours than the general population. One of the submitters, quote, "I've seen so many lives ruined and children going hungry because of gambling harm." I remind you of the submission that I had with my submission from Minnie Ratama and the matching one from her daughter of the horrors of living with this kind of addiction. 17 million lost in Napier last year, and just 40% is used for funding and grants. And there's no obligation from the industry to return it to the community it comes from. So again, I say, this policy is the main lever for you to prevent, well, it's the only one, almost the only one, to prevent gambling-related harm. Finally, if I can find my sheet. You asked the community what they thought and what they wanted, and they told you. Nearly all submitters want a positive change, reducing gambling harm by reducing machines. The most popular recommendation is for a sinking lid and a ban on relocations. This will not cripple existing recipients of gaming grants, who you remember, none of whom submitted to warn us of this. Napier people do not want pokies venues to grow or to spread. They know that pokies are addictive. Many have seen their damaging effects and they're asking you to further regulate them. The gambling venues policy is the main lever for local authorities to reduce gambling-related harm. You asked for community input and you certainly got it. Good luck in your deliberations. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you very much, Max. I'll open up for questions from councillors. You're off the hook. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Max.
Martin Chair, welcome.
Page up, page down.
No, you can use the mouse if you want to, or you can use the arrows.
Okay,
But you can just
great.
use that if you want.
Well, good morning, kia ora tātou. My name's Martin Chair. I'm the Chief Executive of Pub Charity Limited. Pub Charity's operated gaming machines in the Napier jurisdiction for the 27 years that they've been legal, and we consider ourselves a major corporate stakeholder in the community and with a number of community groups. We operate 4 venues in the Napier District, Napier City TLA of 58 machines. Over the last 3 years since the last policy review, we've distributed 495 grants to a total of $5.9 million. I'm not aware that we've blacklisted anybody, so I'm not sure where that claim comes from. Pub Charity supports policy option 1, a cap at the current machine numbers, and the main reason for that is it's consistent with the purposes of the Gambling Act. The Gambling Act never envisaged a prohibition on gaming machines. In fact, gaming machines are one of the 4 licensed and lawful activities in New Zealand, and the purposes of the Act were to create a framework that Class 4 gambling could be conducted with a balance of objectives. I've highlighted the purposes that really are around the framework. So there was an anticipation of growth, not a prohibition strategy, that gambling would be authorised in the community. And I think one of the things that occurs in these policy discussions that's often lost is the counterfactual, which is what would occur if gaming machines weren't here. the underlying assumption would be that public health outcomes would improve. That's the claim. But what we've seen, and we saw this quite evidently during the lockdown in relation to COVID, was people migrated to other forms of gambling that provided a far from safe environment. In fact, the Sky City Casino in fact, by coincidence, launched its online gaming platform out of the United Kingdom just before lockdown, and both Sky City and Lotto reported massive increases in online gambling activity, both in signed-up members and in expenditure. In fact, their online portal went from expenditure of $200,000 to $7 million in the space of 12 months, which will show you that that's the counterfactual for this argument. This is not, as Ms. Bogue would like to frame it, an argument between the industry and those who would oppose the industry. There are people that play these machines. 1 in 5 people here in this community play these machines at least once a year. There are businesses that host those machines that receive income from that results in employment, and there are a large number of community groups that do receive funding. And clearly they weren't intimidated into being involved in this process because they chose not to. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, particularly that they feel the council's taken a balanced approach. I think they seen the proposal and decided, well, this is the preferred option, and that's what will be proceeded with. I think those that oppose gaming machines are a fairly predictable group. Some you would expect them to oppose gaming machines. Some of them are that way inclined and have that view, and they've participated. I think the silence of those people that receive funding shouldn't be confused with an absence of consideration for these policy options. I think they believe you've made the right choice. In fact, their silence could be interpreted as such. Again, the Gambling Act, we talked about facilitating responsible gambling. There has been an attempt by the Department of Internal Affairs to impose conditions on a venue in Wellington that would have effectively restricted gambling activity, and this was the Gambling Commission's opinions, who are the unilateral body that oversees the administration of the Gambling Act. And they actually struck down the condition imposed by the department because they saw it as simply a means of reducing gambling generally rather than reducing problem gambling. And I'd suggest that that's because reducing gambling generally has proved to be particularly ineffective at dealing with issues like problem gambling. Because the alternative is that people simply migrate from controlled and supervised spaces with limited options, with controlled and regulated technical specifications, limited bet sizes, limited jackpot sizes. They simply migrate into options that don't have any of those controls, and the main thing that's missing is a lack of supervision. Ultimately, sinking lids simply reduce funding, not problem gambling. The evidence is quite clear. Statistically, the Ministry of Health measure the prevalence rate of problem gambling in New Zealand on an annual basis and report on it on a 3-yearly basis. So, as a result of these type of policies, we've seen a substantial reduction in the number of machines in New Zealand, gaming machines in New Zealand in the community. In fact, along with population growth, the exposure rate of the adult population in New Zealand to gaming machines has halved since 2005. So the expectation would be, based on the arguments this Ms. Bogue puts forward, that you'd see a corresponding reduction in the prevalence rate of problem gambling in the community. There's a linear relationship. This would be quite logical, wouldn't it? Except this is not the nature of this disorder. So what we've seen is that Class 4 sector has been decimated, and grant funding has declined as a result of that, in inflation-adjusted terms by 1/3. And those of you in the community that are applying for these funds will tell you that if those have been doing that for some time, will tell you the amount of funding available has reduced significantly from the Class 4 sector. Gambling spend has increased by almost 20% over that period, so it's simply migrated to other forms of activity with a less significant contribution to the community, or as we talked about, less safety structures in place. In the meantime, the Ministry of Health reports that the problem gambling prevalence rate is unchanged. So if this was a lever that's your promise, if you pull this lever, you'll see a significant improvement in gambling harm. There's no evidence to support that whatsoever. In fact, this has been evident amongst researchers. So this is the leading problem gambling researcher in New Zealand. Well, he was before he disgraced himself. But anyway, and he stated in a research paper published in 2007 from research he did in 2006, EGM, that's gaming machine reductions, and introduction of caps generally appear to have little impact. More recently, in some jurisdictions that have experienced prolonged and increased availability of gaming machines, prevalent rates of problem gambling have remained constant or even declined. So this is the Ministry of Health's conclusion based on the statistics. As included, there has probably been no change in the prevalence of current problem gambling and moderate risk gambling since 2006. It is considered likely that the prevalence of problematic gambling, both current and lifetime, within the range assessed as pathological problem and moderate risk gambling, reduced significantly during the 1990s before councils had a policy input, and has stayed at about the same level ever since, which is significant in that it's one of the lowest rates in the world, at 0.2% of the adult population. And even the Problem Gambling Foundation, who will speak here later today and say the exact opposite, were pushed on this issue in 2007 to come up with some evidence, and they conceded that there was no correlation between increased gambling and increased problem gambling and the growth in gambling opportunities. Does not establish causation. So it's not the lever that you're being promised. It doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, the rhetoric around it's the machines and the machine numbers stops an effective problem gambling strategy being developed and implemented in this country. I just want to bring your attention to something in the proposal paper that talked about the status quo resulting in a sinking lid would restrain the increase in problem gambling, suggesting that the status quo or even the policy option would lead to an increase in problem gambling prevalence in the communities. Now, again, no evidence of that in the long term, no evidence of that locally. It's just simply not the nature of the disorder. That's a very confused statement and really couldn't be relied on as any sort of confidence that a sinking lid actually would reduce it, or the status quo will increase the prevalence rate of problem gambling. So we support your policy option. We see it as a balanced and proportionate policy response. It's consistent with the Gambling Act. It allows all of the stakeholders, including those that play the machines, those that receive the funds from the machines, those that host the machines, and those that are employed in the industry, to continue this balancing act that we walk. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Martin. We heard from a submitter earlier today who had done some research which showed that we were amongst had the highest number of gaming machines per capita in the country. And I guess I'm just interested in hearing your views on that, because it does seem to indicate to me that we're out of sync with what's happening throughout the rest of the country with regards to the volume of gaming opportunities that are available.
Well, for a start, I'd be surprised if that was actually the case, because the highest ratios are actually in smaller communities. Like Bulla has the highest ratio of machines per head of population. Napier would sit probably in the top third. I'd have to go away and come back to actually confirm whether that's the case or not. It certainly wouldn't be the highest. Ironically, the lowest ratio of population to gaming machines is in South Auckland. So the actual demographics in the population play a major part in the prevalence rate. And you know, the help seeking activity is an indication, but not necessarily a major indicator. Probably the dimension of the demographic that will put you most at risk is in the high deprivation communities. That's probably where the risk escalates. When you look at the venues located in the urban environment, for example, or in the CBD, for example, there's probably an element there of supervision and control. The nature of the people playing the machines is different, so the risk profile is different. And that's the risk profile is not as linear in raw numbers. It's probably there are vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals, and unfortunately we don't develop a customised policy to address those people that are at risk. We tend to address the machine, the environment, and you know, this has been treated as a public health issue for far too long. This is a mental health issue, and individuals and individual risk need to be factored in. So I think responding to that, if a policy that reflected where your risk is in the community versus a blanket approach would be far more effective. And it's too late to consider that in this round, but there'd be areas that you may want to see a reduction. but you may want to bring it into the CBD where this is the hub of, and you're a tourist centre, you have a large number of events here, so you're going to be drawing on a large population that are reasonably affluent as well. So I'd have to I will look into that and come back to you with a response as to statistically where the city sits.
And we do already have provision within the policy to actually prevent new venues or additional gaming machines going into those more vulnerable communities. So it's actually pleasing to hear that from your perspective, that's something you're also acknowledging, that there are perhaps parts of our city where it's not the best to have additional gaming machines going in there.
And we think technology is a big part of this. I mean, we've installed facial recognition technology in our venues because the exclusion system works. If people are identified or want to be excluded from the venues, we need to do everything we can to support them. The problem is, as an initiative, the more it's used, if it relies on human beings to eyeball people, the more it's used, the less effective it becomes, because people can't physically remember 100 faces. And there's a very active provider in this area that does reach out and exclude a lot of people. So the facial recognition technology is highly accurate and allows us to keep excluded people out of our venues. We'd like to see, as Pub Charity, adopted industry-wide. And I think the onus is on the industry to create safe environments, and those are the things that we're pushing for. There are some technologies on the horizon that allow people to identify and create a kind of a player tracking, spend tracking, where it's customised to the individual. Again, it's not cheap, but the society should bear the costs of that. I think it's just part of being a responsible citizen, corporate citizen.
Councillor McGrath.
Yes, just through the chair, a couple of questions. You mentioned the facial recognition technology. Do you have that in place in Napier in your venues?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. And you mentioned, following on from Mayor Wise's comments, don't mind me, with regards to number of people to machines. Now, we're a tourist town, and you alluded to that a little bit. Is there a measure anywhere that measures local spend opposed to tourist spend when we're coming up with all this data?
No, it's not possible to actually, other than in a very crude sense, to say that areas like, say, Queenstown Lakes are going to attract a lot of outside people. Just simply looking at the number of events that you hold here and the type of people that come here, that's going to play a major part in the spend per capita. And we see things playing out in the economy, like when the oil and gas exploration was cancelled in the Waikato and the dairy price was down, the expenditure in that Waikato area collapsed, while it grew in areas where there was quite a lot of migration. That's the other thing, internal migration. I mean, your population pressures here would have been significant. You've probably had a lot of people move here in recent years.
So when we have the stats put in front of us of how much money per machine or how much money based on our population, they may not be very accurate or as accurate in a tourist-based town.
Well, no doubt the council tries to quantify the number of visitors, and you can count the fact that it's between 1 in 5 and about 1 in 7 of those people will play a gaming machine, because they played the gaming machine where they came from. They'll probably play the gaming machines when they come here as well. So if your population's inflated by 20%, then 20% of the spend will be coming from outside. It's a pretty crude measure, but it would be indicative and it should be factored in.
Thank you.
I'm conscious we're sort of a little bit over time, but just an opportunity for one more question if anyone. Councillor Crystal.
What concerned me a little bit about your presentation is that it was all based on New Zealand wide, whereas in Napier here we do have a significantly high number of machines per capita. The stats have been shown to us, and a very high rate of gambling problems. And so, I think it's great you do the facial recognition, but not all. Obviously, the groups are doing things like that, and sort of facts that related to here would be really good, because we are quite out of whack from what I can read compared to a lot of places in the country.
Is there a question there?
Yeah, I'm just trying to say, it would be really good to get that sort of stats as far as pub charities goes. But
I think it's right to consider each population uniquely and within in the same way. That's why we have a deprivation scale. And really what goes with deprivation tends to be poorer judgment. Tends to be the comorbidity that's a factor, and that's another thing I haven't really touched on, that 90% of people that seek help for problem gambling actually are diagnosed with multiple comorbidities with other mental and physical issues. Multiple addictions are common. So gambling might be a manifestation of deep-seated and complex problems. And again, if you blame the machine, you miss the opportunity to identify those people and put in place a complex strategy around them. And we waste a lot of resources, things that we don't control as the sector. But the Ministry of Health, I think, has been on the wrong track for almost 20 years now as far as targeting communities and individuals that are vulnerable. To try and work in it from the outside, I think there's a slide here that sort of reflects this situation. I mean, try to reach that person in the circle through all of these other people is a very hard thing to do, and the upshot of it is I don't think we're doing it very well. I think we do them a disservice. So yes, there are segments in your community that you should be concerned about, but concerned about on multiple fronts as well. And there's links back to poverty, poor education, other negative health outcomes, mental health issues. And again, I find it extremely frustrating that we talk about prohibition as a solution. Prohibition has never worked. The synthetic cannabis example where people were dying in the streets, basically, and we thought prohibition was the answer. We reached for prohibition. It's a simple tool. It helps us sleep at night, but in reality, it's proved to be a total failure because these policies and the reduction in the machines have not moved that problem gambling prevalence rate at all. And all we're seeing is a migration to people into unsupervised environments, and that's really harm will get out of control.
I will just allow one more question from Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
I actually think your last comments have kind of covered it off. I was going to say we're seeing a national push with some of our larger centres into sinking lid, prohibition style policies, and just interested in your view on that. But I think your slide here and your last comments have kind of covered that off.
Yeah, the big impact has been Auckland and Christchurch. They're the two largest markets, and Auckland's had a sinking lid since 2007. But the problem gambling prevalence rate hasn't moved. And therein, you want to pull that lever, then go ahead and pull it. But if you are, coming with the promise that there's going to be some magical solution, it hasn't proved to be the case at all. And I think the other thing, the mentality behind it is very much in the sort of 1980s, really, where the state and local government controlled licences for everything. So therefore, if a person wanted to access something, a licensed activity, whether it be drinking or gambling, they would go to a licensed premise. Well, basically, supermarkets have destroyed that myth with alcohol, and basically online gambling has destroyed it with as far as gambling is concerned. So, as far as that's what I mean about any economic analysis should consider the counterfactual. It's got to, which is, okay, what if you were successful? Let's continue that to the logical conclusion. Would gambling stop in this community? Not at all.
Thank you very much, Martin. I will stop us
I appreciate
there
that.
so
Thank
we
you.
can move on to our next submitter, Samuel. Welcome, Samuel.
We banned Class A drugs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sam Tokuingoa on the pastor of Bay Vineyard Church, and submitting on behalf of my congregation who have submitted a number of their own submissions. Just a quick introduction about myself. Our church is 3 years old. We started it, we met at Napier Boys High School. Last 3 years we've grown to over 200 members. We've got a very strong love for this community, and there's a number of programs that we are currently working on in terms of pilot programs to serve this community, building healthy whānau, Te Hāhi, working with the police to support people that have encountered some domestic harm, raising hope to help people, young women particularly facing crisis pregnancies, and we currently have a pilot course helping folks with supporting them get stronger, to have stronger budgets. And particularly that one's a key one for us as we look at this issue of problem gambling, that actually not only do I think we want to help people restrict the number of gambling machines so that people can make good decisions, but also we want to help people enable them to have stronger budgets so that they can move forward with hope rather than look into things like pokies. And I just want to express my deep gratitude to the work of Maxine and others that they've done to protect the suburb of Maraenui. That in particular is an area that we as a church are very, very passionate about. We're working with local community leaders there to do our best to see that community flourish. You're going to hear today the statistics over and over and again about the fact that 1 in 3 people that use pokie machines have a problem with gambling. And you're going to hear, and this is well researched, there's no contention around these statistics. You're going to hear statistics around the fact that a typical problem gambler negatively impacts 6 other people, inflicts harm on partners and children and parents and siblings and grandparents. There's a consistent evidence linking harmful gambling and family violence. And this comes out of research out of Melbourne and the Australian Gambling Research Centre there. But the problem is, and this is one of the big issues when it comes to this particular bylaw, is that the discussion of the bylaw and the benefits in the community is all detached from the stories of the people that are negatively impacted by problem gambling. And it's very easy to get detached and therefore make decisions that do not take into account the stories of the people that are impacted by problem gambling. And I think, you guys are around the table because you care for this community. I'm a pastor because I care for this community. And therefore, I think we have a duty to do everything that we can to make this region and this city in particular a place where it's easy to make good decisions and difficult to make bad ones. And while I agree that, it's a very blunt tool, legislation, it is a helpful tool. But that needs to be coupled with services that will help people that have struggled with problem gambling to get the support they need, yes, for their mental health and for things like budgeting support, to help people that have no clue how to budget, to get a budget in place in their families so that they don't resort to wishing that hopefully they can get some windfall on a gambling thing to get themselves out of a pickle. It simply doesn't work. The reality is that only 2/3 of the people there are, and again, we've got the tourists and all the rest of it, and they want to have a flutter. But again, 1/3 of these people have a problem with gambling. They are people with stories and families, and we should take them serious. It was interesting. It's very interesting to follow Martin Cheer and his particular perspective. And I appreciate why they strongly want to keep the rules as they are. But at the end of the day, you're a council who are here to serve the community and not to make decisions based on what a gambling trust wants, but making decisions on what our community wants. And clearly through the submissions, the community want to see the cap lowered in terms of the number of pokies that we have. And the reality is that those gambling trusts make huge amount of money. There's very little transparency about where the funding goes. And you'll notice none of that was mentioned in the presentation that we just heard. There's a tragic lack of transparency when it comes to where the money goes. And so they are going to obviously lobby hard to keep the income coming in for their particular trust because they are directly benefiting from it. But our community does not benefit from it. I think the argument about people going online, I can appreciate that, but there's the counter argument to that is number one, using lockdown as an example about what people do in terms of when pokers are closed is ridiculous. People were very, very stressed during lockdown, and I can tell you that drinking went up and all sorts of other stuff went up because people were stressed, so using that as an example is ridiculous. Secondly, there was no statistics around that, there's no research around that, and so it's all anecdotal, and I can tell you that anecdotally, if people want to gamble online, it's far easier to do that than to go down to the local pokie machine. And so if people wanted to gamble online, they would anyway. And obviously there needs to be legislation around all of that, but I think that's a ridiculous argument in terms of why we should keep pokies in our community. From a purely economic perspective, the research shows that for every $1 that comes into a community organisation from a pokie-funded trust, foundation, society or club, $3 has been lost from the community. So this costs our community. And again, I have simply ethically, for clubs to receive money from pokie, I can appreciate why people do this, but again, it's detached from the true cost of where that money has come from. And I would argue that it's unconscionable to exploit people, especially those who are poor or less able to protect themselves from exploitation. And that actually, if those clubs were sitting down face to face with problem gamblers and seeing the impact in the community, that they, I would hope, would choose not to take that money. There has to be a different way in terms of how funding how community clubs can receive funding. And trust me, I want the funding. I want your funding. We've got not only the Bay Vineyard Trust, but we've got the Manawa Order Community Trust that we've established to do all these programs that we're piloting, particularly in Maraenui and other places. So we want funding. But what we need is we need pokie machine losses to be replaced with a government grants program. And if that were to happen, 4 things would be achieved. Community and sports funding would be secured so services can continue to be delivered where they're needed. Secondly, there's 3 things. Losses from the most deprived communities would stop being diverted to national public programs and national sports interests. But thirdly, and most importantly, there'd be some flippant transparency about who gets the money and what it's used for. It seems ridiculous to me that those that struggle with problem gambling, that their money would be taken from them and that it would be distributed to who knows where. That's crazy. There needs to be far more transparency when it comes to where the money goes. So I would contend that this isn't a difficult decision. To choose to stay passive on this costs our community that you are charged with leading and caring for. And leaders, which you guys are, make difficult decisions for people. And even pragmatically, when it comes to the election cycles, this is a good time to make a difficult decision for the community. You know, I realise that there's certain times of the cycle that you want to be a bit more cautious. This is not one of those times. Go for it. Make the decision for the best of our community. In closing, thank you for all that you do for this community. Thank you so much for the fact that you are prepared to endure many meetings and many submissions because you deeply care for this community. I couldn't do what you do, but I'm grateful that you do it. He waka ika noa, we're all in this together, friends. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I'll open up for questions from the councillors. Councillor McGrath.
Yeah, just through the chair. Samuel, you say the lack of transparency on where the money goes. Many of the submitters today have actually listed where their money goes. I think the last submitter mentioned something like 5 million came back and it's all listed here in front of us.
Listed where it goes, but it's not listed where it's from.
Yep, correct.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yep.
Of course they can tell you where it goes, but there's no transparency about where it's come from. Is that from Manukau? Is that from South Auckland? Are we happy for that? That's the issue for me. I appreciate they can tell you who's got what in the community, and it's a fantastic carrot to dangle in front of folks. But they haven't told you where it's come from in the country.
Any further questions?
Sorry, I'm fired up about this, but I think we should care because we're here. Because last thing, these sort of bylaws protect the vulnerable, and I think we want to be a community that protects the vulnerable. Like that, surely is something that we should all be on agreement on, and. Even if folks that don't have a problem gambling, there's plenty of other places they can go. Flipping the TAB's been pushed hard out. You can gamble on just about anything in rugby these days. First blade of grass to get touched. I mean, it's people can have a flutter in lots of ways. But this is a place that people go because they are not tech savvy, and there is a highly addictive nature to how these machines are made. They're wired to get you addicted. And amazingly, 66% of people don't, but a large chunk do, and they are predominantly from vulnerable places.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing with us today.
It's good to meet you guys. I've been around for 3 years, but I've been waiting because we want to work with you guys, even though I've come and swinging today. Really do want to work with you guys in terms of the ground level stuff to help people. As I said, we've got budgeting services happening. We've got all sorts of stuff to strengthen our community on the ground, and we've got a large number of people deeply passionate about this community. So we're here to support and serve you guys, and you're on the ground anyway. God bless.
Thank you. Now, Nigel and Liz, I was wondering if I would need your patience.
This high school receiving money from these guys.
Unless you need to dash off, and then we'll just let her know that. Is it? Okay, thank you so much. So we will just move ahead one submission to Tina McIvor, the PGF group, who is joining us via Zoom.
Kia ora koutou. I hope you can hear me. I'm calling in from Paikakiriki in Wellington. I am the health promotion lead at the Problem Gambling Foundation. We have an interest in this policy review because under the Gambling Act 2003, there's a very strong public health impetus. There's an obligation to minimise the harm from gambling to society at large. So we're interested in what happens around the country. Now, we run counselling services throughout the country. We support our sister organisation in the Hawke's Bay, Te Rangi Te Haiata, and we work together to minimise harm, prevent harm under the Gambling Act. Now, you may have heard already, but you'll surely hear from some submitters that online gambling is an increasing concern for the people we see. I'd just like to suggest that the jurisdiction here for the council is Class 4 gambling in pubs and clubs under the Act. We're not here to consider online gambling, and the central government's looking at legislation to regulate that particular area and that particular area of harm. So Class 4 pokies in pubs and clubs cause the most harm in terms of gambling harm. 50% of our clients present with harm from using pokies. As the previous submitter said, they're highly addictive. And in terms of the funding, the community funding, he's certainly right, looking to where the money's coming from. These machines are clustered around the country. You're not alone in Napier. They're clustered in high deprivation areas, and we've got to look at where the money's coming from and where it's going and how much is being distributed in the community. There is some mystery around how much is going back. Generally, under legislation, it should be 40% going back to the community, but we find throughout the country that there's a lot less going back to particular communities, and there's some central funds that are quite mysterious, and we haven't heard from the industry exactly where everything's going. You might hear that the machine numbers are going down. Yes, and the harm that we detect in the community is on a plateau, but actually spend is going up throughout the country. You've got a $20 million spend in Napier. And, you know, the best public health policy we've got available to us is a sinking lid policy where we prevent new venues opening up in your area. Now that's a preventative mechanism. Spend is still going up. So there's probably other mechanisms that you can use to address harm in your communities. The numbers of people that present to services, often the industry will say, oh, there's, you know, problem gambling is a very small problem in the community. Well, actually, only about 15% of people with a problem present to services, and for each person, there's at least 5 to 10 other people in their families or whānau who are harmed from that person's gambling. Because by the time they present, it's often the really severe end of harm. We're talking severe mental health, we're talking criminal behaviour, we're talking family violence. That's where the rubber hits the road in terms of the people that present for help to our services. Now, I do have a presentation that I better start. Now I need to share my screen, actually. Let's see if I can do that. Yes, here we go. Share screen. Can you see that?
We can, thank you.
Great, okay. So here we are in Napier. Tiny little area. And you've got 20.16 million coming out of your poker machines in the last year. We just need to look at the sheer amount of money to consider harm. And the Ministry of Health talks about financial harm being the first place where harm occurs to a community. You've got 298 pokies and 20 venues. There were 2 pokie machines that sort of appeared in the last wee while, I think. Now, venues by deprivation, you've got them clustered in the medium to medium high end in terms of deprivation areas, that they far outnumber the medium low and none in the very low. Impact on communities, almost 50%, what I said earlier about people who present for gambling harm to services are those affected by class 4 poker. Don't get distracted by online gambling and the growth in online gambling, because you're here to look at those places and those venues. And I hope that each councillor has sort of gone in and visited venues and had a look, just get a sense of who's there and what's happening in those venues. Impact by ethnicity, you find that Māori are 2.5% more likely to be harmed in this area or present with harm. Pacifica 2.2 and Asian 2.0. We're asking council to look, remember, commit, no relocations, and lastly I'll talk about a petition that we're encouraging councils to do. So in terms of reducing harm, that's one of our significant points, is just look to where the money is lost and who is losing it in your community. It's not a small amount of money. It's huge. And imagine if that money was used in a different way within your community. We have worked with the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, and they've published a report about where that money might go nationally if it wasn't spent in pokie machines. And happy to share that afterwards if you haven't seen it already. Looking at the community funding system that is used to justify this harm in the community in terms of harm from pokie machines, 60% goes into the system to run the system. It's only 40% redistributed, and that's legislated for. However, to the other person submitter's point, it is very difficult to track it all. Now, commit to reducing the numbers of pokie machines with a sinking lid. I see that your preferred option is not a sinking lid. It's not really on the table, but if you could reconsider that, now that potentially you've learned a whole lot more around pokie machines, then a preventative mechanism would be a sinking lid with no relocations and no club mergers. Now, club mergers are where clubs like RSAs or sports clubs merge, and they retain their pokie licenses, and they can end up with up to 30 machines in one venue. So we want to stop that from happening, because you find that clusters of pokie machines cause more harm, and so that's an element to look at too. Also, is that a bell? Okay, I better hurry up. Clubs generally should focus on what they're there for, to bring people together within the RSA or a sports club, rather than relying on pokies to keep going, keeping afloat. Okay, reducing harm, no relocations. We prefer, once venue shuts down, those machines are taken out of the system. They're not moved into other areas. You don't want to move the problem to somewhere else. Petition. Okay, the CE of our organisation is very intent on encouraging councillors to talk to the Minister of Internal Affairs if you care deeply about preventing harm, and look to use Section 314 of the Gambling Act to that section in the Act is where the Minister can create regulations through the Governor-General to just limit the number of machines in certain areas in a blanket kind of an approach. So that is a very effective way potentially could be used through the Act. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. We'll just open quickly to see if we have any questions from councillors.
Just one.
Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Thank you, Tina, for your presentation. I'm just interested, I know you referred throughout in your submission about the preventative measure being the zero, essentially sinking lid down to zero. I just wonder, that's something that we've heard kind of conflicting evidence on in reality, in a factual way, and I'm interested in your view on that actually problem gambling isn't solved by a sinking lid policy and prohibition as such.
Yeah, well, in terms of class 4 gambling, well, I imagine if there was complete prohibition and there were no machines, you would find a different story and it would be solved. We just haven't got evidence to show that. But in terms of bringing machine numbers down, it's the best public health policy available to you when you're looking at this issue, that you can prevent new venues from opening up in your area. And that's like preventing a growth in terms of venues. It's not preventing the ones that are already there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Tina. Much appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nigel, for your patience. We will pull you up now, please.
Good morning. No presentation, PowerPoint from myself. I'm going to talk from the heart. So I'm here this morning not representing the New Zealand Fire Service. I sit on the Safer Community Group, which I've sat on for several years, the Safer Napier Community Group. There's 40 different organisations that sit on that group, and we are very keen to reduce harm within our community. So that's who I'm here presenting this morning. We have five key goals, and one of those is reducing gambling and alcohol and illicit drugs within the community, and one of our key areas. You've already heard this morning a lot of what we're saying is that gambling contributes to the deprivation of individuals, families and communities. And we already heard that a disproportionate amount of that gambling loss is carried by those people that are on income support and that can't manage that. So I'm not going to repeat what's already been said there. The Safer Neighbourhood Group supports the following options. Option 3, adopt a sinking lid, and option 4, removal of reallocation. Reducing the number of, we believe that reducing the number of gambling venues will assist reducing harm. This provides the opportunity to bring Napier's gambling policy in line with Hastings' gambling policy, we have a sinking lid approach, and this will align the two areas already aligned with a joint alcohol strategy. So it just makes sense that we don't have different policies against two councils that are so close, and potentially we will get those problems coming over to us here in Napier. And we also want to reduce the number of pokies in the poor areas, which we've already heard about. We don't believe that a small change, i.e. limiting the cap for poker machines, will be effective in reducing gambling harm. A sinking lid policy will remove the reallocation of machines, and we believe it will help reduce the harm. Apart from the gambling value policy, we have other thoughts and thinks the council preventing gambling. Apart from gambling venues policy, what ways do you think the council can prevent gambling? Several agencies have a responsibility for gambling. The role of the council under the Local Government Act is to develop and review Class 4 venues and issue licences to prevent poker machines. The gambling venue is our main the gambling venue policy is a main lever to contribute to preventing related harm. However, Napier City regulatory team could periodically ensure that venues are complying with their host responsibilities. This is a requirement under Gambling Act 2003. This is a role of the Department of Internal Affairs, but Napier City Council could work in partnership to proactively assist them in this. We've heard quite a lot about where the money goes, and not being very clear. We would like to see the Napier City Council advocate at a national level on ensuring fair distribution of the grants, and that the money spent here in Napier goes back to Napier to assist. We've already heard pokies are very harmful to the community. Of the 20 venues here in Napier, 2 are located in areas with high social deprivation, very high, and 11 are located in medium or medium deprivation areas. So we've already heard that quite a lot. We thought 17 million was lost to pokies. We've just heard that 20 million is lost to pokies here in Napier. That's 46,000 a day poker machines, and each poker machine making an average of 57,000 a year. So that's 200, multiply that by 260, 96 poker machines. I've done a little bit of reading before we come out, and it's quite hairy in some of the reading. And one of the things that I picked up on, which I think is worthy of talking about, is we've already heard about where the gambling machines are and how much people are spending on them. But gambling causes over twice the amount of harm than chronic conditions such as osteoarthritis and diabetes. The cost to society is almost double for gambling. So that's our submission. Sorry, I mumbled through that a bit. That's me finished. I'm not taking you 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nigel. And I'll open up for any questions from councillors.
Just like to say, there's 40 organisations in the Safer Napier group who've been working for years to reduce harm, and we do see gambling as harm, and the sinking lid policy is certainly going to be better for us.
Thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated.
Got anything you want to add? Thank you.
Thank you. Next up we have Angie Demby. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm speaking as an individual citizen. Besides my main working life as a primary and special needs teacher, I also trained as an addictions counsellor and worked for the Hawke's Bay DHB for 7 years as a social worker in the mental health team. I also have a family member who is a regular user of pokie machines, a problem gambler. I don't know. There is secrecy and denials. It's early days. 2 points I'd like to make are on harm minimisation, not prohibition. I don't know where that word popped up from, but harm minimisation and the behaviour of trusts. So the first point, back your own Napier City Council Safer Napier accreditation goal of reducing addiction-related harm. We know from evidence that pokies provide the most harmful form of gambling in New Zealand. Machines and venues are designed to keep people playing. An immersive environment, it's called. The random nature of a win gives a dopamine rush. And it's the most vulnerable in society who contribute a large portion of the money going into machines. These are the low socioeconomic community, those with stress in their lives, and those with anxiety and depression. Certainly an increasing group in recent times. Studies show clients are increasingly women and Māori. It is a short drive to any venue in Napier. Napier is 7th of the 66 territorial local authorities for loss of dollars per adult to pokie machines. That was a statistic of December 2019. The Department of Internal Affairs say up to 30% of gamblers have a problem. A 1 in 3 chance of addiction is bad odds. Access to a harmful process, such as gambling machines, or a substance, such as alcohol, is lessened by the lack of availability of it. There is a strong public opinion about this issue and concern for community well-being. The Problem Gambling Foundation say a conservative estimate of 40% of gamblers have problems. That is an even worse odds. So my second point is about trusts, your funders. I'd like to reflect the reports from the Problem Gambling Foundation. Things they bring up is lack of transparency from the pokie industry, apparent lack of following the rules for the rate of return to the local community. If a fund or grant is shared between 2 territorial local authorities, there is no requirement to provide information. Why? Information can be patchy and lacking in detail. And the Problem Gambling Foundation would like wider access to data. So Napier City Councillors, I ask that you give greater attention to minimising the harm of pokie gambling. Go and visit a venue, spend time there. Take on board the unethical nature of funding community grants to sports and community groups from pokies. You have a dilemma. Money in your pocket from community harm. Read the report, Ending Community Sector Dependence on Pokie Funding, written by the Problem Gambling Foundation, the Salvation Army, and Te Hapai Te Ora Tapui. They have provided it for you, I understand. Tighten your oversight of the pokie industry. Monitor the venues as a duty of care for Napier citizens. Invercargill Territorial Local Authority can provide best practice guidelines for this. Support the Problem Gambling Foundation in its work. They are the ones trying to educate us and help the individuals recover who find the courage to ask for help. Follow the path of 23 out of 67 territorial authorities around New Zealand. Auckland, Wellington, Tauranga, Gisborne, Hastings, to name a few, by adopting a sinking lid policy, removing the ability to relocate or merge pokie venues. Let's plan for the type of future that we want for the next generation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Angela. I will just open up to councillors for questions. Was that a hand raised, Councillor Tapane, or no? Okay. And just for the benefit of any attendees who have joined us since earlier today, Counsellors Crown and Price have declared a conflict, so they won't be asking questions or participating in the debate and vote. If there's no questions, I'll thank you very much for your time, Angela. It's much appreciated. So we're now running a little bit of ahead of schedule. Is Wiramu Waratini here? Jared Crow? Ah, fantastic. Thank you. Welcome.
And also through 100. Doesn't matter. No correlation between Nancy Prick and
Thank you. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that hopefully you'll have.
Work like that. Use the keyword prevention.
Thank you. I'm Jared True. I represent the Gaming Machine Association of New Zealand. The association represents the vast majority of gaming machine societies. We also support venues, Hospitality New Zealand and clubs. The association supports the current cap being retained, option 1, and the existing relocation provisions being retained. I'd like to speak to relocation to start with because I think it's really, really important. So relocation is first and foremost a harm minimisation tool. Venue relocation allows venues to move out of undesirable areas such as residential areas and high deprivation areas. Also enables venues to move out of areas where there might be schools, playgrounds or libraries close by. Not allowing relocation simply entrenches those venues in those undesirable locations. The Problem Gambling Foundation continuously tells us that our venues are in undesirable locations, that there's a concern that there's a large amount of venues located in medium to high deprivation areas. And you have two venues currently in very high deprivation areas, 5 in medium, or medium to high, and then some in the other categories and none in the very low category. So if the argument is that the current location of those venues is undesirable because of the very high or medium rating, let's move them. It would be illogical to complain about the existing status quo and then set in a policy that locks those venues in stone and doesn't allow them to move. Having a relocation policy, continuing the existing sensible relocation policy that you have, also has a range of other benefits. It's simply fair and reasonable. It's fair and reasonable that we would allow a venue to re-establish next door or across the road after a fire, flood or earthquake. It's sensible and reasonable to allow a venue that may be in a residential area to move more closer into a central business district. If you've got a venue such as a club in particular that's on a large block of land that would like to move to a smaller modern premise and free up that large block of land for, say, high density housing, the venue should be free to do that and be able to take the gaming machines with it. It also should be possible for a venue operator to move across the road or next door when their landlord's imposing unreasonable terms. At the moment, if you can't move, the landlord knows that. That results in unreasonable rents being imposed, and when it comes to things like doing repair work, that gets placed back on the tenant. And importantly, when we have actually seen venues that have taken advantage of relocation, when they do move, they tend to move to newer, smaller, more affluent, modern premises, which is just absolutely fantastic, and something I would have thought that is exactly what you want for your city. The very first venue to move under the relocation provisions was the Te Rapa Tavern in Hamilton. This was the very first venue that was, after the legislation was passed, it was able to move. The photo on the left is a place where you would go wearing black singlets and white gumboots. The place on the right is where I go after playing indoor netball and have a craft beer. That's the type of transition we see in venues when we move from old rundown type venues to new, modern, high quality venues. Redeveloping venues, allowing them to move, improves the local economy, encourages tourism, and helps with employment. The current cap that you've got is reasonable. It's reasonable given the very low problem gambling rate. It's reasonable given the benefits that come from having the local machines, and it's also a benefit totally appropriate given that the current growth of online gambling. So importantly to start with, the problem gambling rate is already extremely low, 0.2% of the adult population are problem gamblers, and that's in relation to all forms of gambling, not just simply gaming machine gambling. There's no link between gaming machine numbers and problem gambling rates. We've seen sinking lid policies, we've seen restrictive policies being put in place. They've reduced our machine numbers by 25% over the last 10 years. Over 4,600 machines have been taken out of the system. Problem gambling rate hasn't reduced by a quarter. Problem gambling rate has plateaued, stayed the same through that entire period. In my written submission, there's research paper after research paper after research paper that says we've tried removing the machines, we've done that over a decade, the problem gambling rate hasn't changed, simply plateaued. But your current status quo policy is working. It has already reduced the number of venues that we have in Napier City considerably. In 2003, you had 40 gaming venues. That number's now been cut in half. Currently, you only have 20 venues. The current policy is sensible, it's balanced. There's been nothing that's happened in the last 3 years. There's been no new evidence that's come forward. There's been no increase in local harm that would justify a move from the current sensible, balanced policy you have to a more restrictive policy such as a sinking lid. What has changed, however, particularly in light of COVID, is the demand for grant funding from community groups. That has never been higher. The local venues here generate over $8.6 million a year in funding for local community groups. That is fantastic. That funding is extremely valuable and not able to be easily replaced. There's other benefits that come from gambling. 67% of adult New Zealanders gamble at least once a year. It's a recreational activity which a large number of adult New Zealanders participate in. In addition to the significant grant funding that's made, there's also funding to the local hospitality businesses. Over $3 million a year is paid in venue payment to provide the space for the machines, to supervise the machines, to maintain the machines. And there's also $7.19 million a year paid in the government for taxes to help with schools, roads, hospitals, etc. Adopting a more restrictive policy is unlikely to reduce problem gambling, but will result in the migration to online gambling being accelerated. The move to online is real. Has anyone in the room in the last 6 to 12 months purchased a CD to listen to their favourite music track? There's normally one counsellor. Do you have any local video stores anymore?
It's closed.
Has anyone used the yellow pages in the last 12 months?
Doorstop.
Doorstop. Ours sits under our computer monitor to lift it up. Who doesn't have a music streaming service? Who doesn't have Netflix or another form of streaming service? Anyone not use Google Today?
Yep.
Can you tell me what those people in the top left-hand corner are doing?
Dice game.
People have always gambled, and people will always gamble in the future. Even if you just give them 2 coins, they will gamble. That's a photo of people playing tour. Top right was one of our venues. Bottom left, if you pass me your cell phone or your tablet, I can have you playing exactly the same game that's in any of our venues within 3 months on your credit card. The only difference will be the prizes will be higher, the games will be faster, and it will all be done on credit. Facebook and all the social media services, one of their major revenue streams is through the advertising of online gambling. Even our very own New Zealand Sky City has got its now online gambling platform, which it advertised over COVID and had its revenue skyrocket. Again, even Sky City online, pass me your phone, 3 minutes, you're up and running, playing exactly the same games that are in our current 20 venues. This information's out of date. If you have a presentation from the TAB today, and I hope you do, you'll see some more staggering figures. 2017, there was the cabinet paper suggested that there was about $300 million spent in offshore online providers. That has just snowballed since. Back then, 60%-ish of the TAB's turnover came from online devices. People, if you want to bet on the horses, people were picking up their phones, their tablets, putting the bet, rather than going to the physical TAB stores. And back then, it was estimated to be growing at 12 to 20% a year. Niall will give you a presentation, I hope he does. Those figures are now dwarfed by the current stats. Offshore online-based gambling is undesirable. It creates no local grants. It creates no local employment. There's no New Zealand taxes that are generated. There's no harm minimisation wrapped around it. There's no regulations or controls over bet limits or prize limits or tapping people on the shoulder every 15 minutes. There's massively large prizes on offer. Maximum you can bet on our machines is $2.50. The maximum prize you can win is $1,000. There's no inducements at our venues to gamble. In the online world, if you've played and then you've spent all your money and you've been absent for a period of 24 hours, you'll get an email that pops in or a text or a push notification to your phone saying, you're a good customer, we've missed you, we've just put $50 into your account, come back and play. Thank you. Welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Jared. I'll open up to councillors for questions. Councillor McGrath.
It's just through the chair. I read in someone's submission somewhere with regards to the relocation policy that the DIA support the policy. Are you aware of that one way or the other?
You would think that the government department would support relocation, given it advocated for the law to be changed to include relocation, and it's only a recent thing, the ability to relocate. So I would be surprised if any government department would be against relocation. Even councils that have taken a very strict approach towards relocation, such as Hamilton, which Hamilton's mayor spent his own personal money putting up large billboards, anti-gambling, anti-pokies billboards. Hamilton still has a sinking lid with a relocation policy.
They've got a casino.
Hastings has gone very strict with their sinking lid policy. They still allow relocation because they see the benefits in that.
And just another question you may be able to answer for me. Out of the revenue that's gained from the Class 4 machines, 1.5% of that income goes towards, I guess, gambling harm mitigation, something like 20 million a year.
Yeah.
Just from your knowledge, do the other means of gambling fund into that? I know the online doesn't, but do you know if lottos and TABs and...
Offshore online gambling, zip. The other providers, the casinos, Lotto and TAB via race and sports betting do contribute as well. But we contribute approximately half of that $20 million. We contribute the bulk of it through that problem gambling levy. So yes, everyone contributes, but we contribute the most.
Thank you.
Councillor Tapani.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your submission. Hoping you can clarify something for me. So you mentioned in your submission that a part of our decision and deliberation will be around the relocation option. I was wondering whether or not, and this is more of a point to absence of knowledge on my behalf, are there any rules or industry-based standards, as opposed to those that we can implement, that encourage socially responsible decision-making when it comes to relocation? Does the industry drive? Do you know of any industry-driven standards to encourage more socially responsible decisions around relocations?
Well, I think what we want is we want clean, modern, fresh venues that we can be proud of. And we also want to see our venues being relocated to more central business districts. So when we have got operators that are out in the fringes and areas that may be desirable and premises that you walk in and they're clearly falling apart around you, absolutely that's front of mind, looking at options of being able to move to modern, cleaner, fresher, normally smaller premises.
Okay, where I'm coming from is I understand that transition. I'm a council in a city that has depreciating historical assets, so I get the old new argument. But I was wondering whether or not location, not just the ambience and look and feel of that, but whether the industry itself drives some criteria around location, or I understand the need for around central business. For example, in Napier, we have one which has recently closed. It has relocated, but it has relocated to an area where there is equally an unfortunate amount of social deprivation. And so I'm just wondering, where within the industry, are there any indicators, any great examples, any indicators that the industry itself identifies the need to make those sorts of decisions and is looking to shift the way they prioritise locations?
Yeah, well, you're talking 37 different traditional societies, 1,500 odd venues, those decisions made by typically the individual operators of those businesses. What I can tell you, and proud to tell you, is out of the bulk of the venues that have relocated, they have moved to newer modern premises. That the premises tend to go from basically only selling alcohol, to selling a substantial food offering, which is complemented by drink sales. And when those venues have done that, and they're proud of their new establishments, we've actually seen the gaming revenue decline slightly as a result of that. And no one's objecting to that. So
just based on what you mentioned, so it's great, but you mentioned that essentially that basically comes down to the individual owners. Is that what I heard?
It's their call.
Okay.
It's their primary business.
Thank you. The last couple of questions, if I may, Your Worship. Mm-hmm. Your slide, and it's not the first time I've seen the statistic today around the 0.2% or 0.1% of harm. Yep. Would you say that that statistic is based upon gambling nationally rather than just Class 4, or are you suggesting that statistic represents only Class 4?
So to be clear, it's 0.2% of the adult population for all forms of gambling.
All forms.
So that includes all forms. And approximately 48% of everyone that goes to the treatment providers indicates that their gambling relates to Class 4 gambling. So probably half of that, or just short of half of that, probably 0.1% would relate to our machines.
Sorry, this is just a what type of gambling?
Class 4.
Oh, Class 4, sorry.
Gaming machines.
Old fella. All right, cool bananas. And so we've heard quite a bit of information. Last question, Your Worship. We've heard quite a bit of information today around gaps and links of information and data between some assumptions or ideas of where we could go forward. So is it the position of your organisation that there is no clear link between Class 4 activity and social harm?
There's no clear link between gaming machine numbers and problem gambling rates, absolutely.
Gaming machine numbers. Right, thank you.
Councillor Crystal.
We heard today from the pub charities that they are using facial recognition as a form of trying to help with harm. Is that something that you would look at to bring in through all your venues?
Absolutely, we would love to. Absolutely. I'm a big advocate and have been for a very, very long time. The great irony is that the industry's been pro-facial recognition. The people that have pushed back on it is the regulator, concerned about the costs, and our friends at the Problem Gambling Foundation concerned about privacy. We just want to get it done. And we're slowly getting there. If you go to Gisborne, say I'd like to register as a problem gambler, get your photo in the system, then try to go to any other venue in town, because every single venue in Gisborne has got facial recognition. I'll buy you a bottle of wine if you make it more than 5 metres into the venue without getting caught.
Thank you. One last question from, unless anyone else has got a question, I'll allow Councillor Tapani one more question.
Thank you, Your Worship. This is not as in your face as my previous one, so you can take a deep breath. But I did hear some comments today around, particularly from who you call your friends, those members of our society who work at the other end of the spectrum and dealing with the harm. So something they did mention was around host responsibility and the role that it plays. Is there anything you'd like to add around host responsibility from your perspective, and how, or perhaps that's encouraged or discouraged within your organisation?
Absolutely. If you've got time, I could have half an hour and I could start telling you about every single.
Sorry, Your Worship, wrong question.
Responsibility we do. It would take that long. Bet sizes are reduced. Prize sizes are reduced. The sweeps, the staff go through the room every 15 minutes. The staff get trained every 6 months. There's posters on every wall. There's videos on every wall. Every single gaming machine has a clock on it. I could literally go on for half an hour. Everything that you could possibly think of to make the machines and the environment safer, someone's thought about it in central government and made it a regulation, and it's there. And then our venues then get spot checked and audited by the Department of Internal Affairs to make sure those measures are being adhered to.
So, reading between the lines, would you suggest that there's sufficient services and or ranges of services to help provide for good host responsibility? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for your time today, Jared. Much appreciated. We have one final submission before the lunch break. Waramu Waratini? No.
Whose fault was it?
So that's us.
Or was the husband?
Finishing 10 minutes early, and we're due back at 1:10 for our afternoon submitters.
I get it, but what's... Sorry. I thought we'd finished.
1:10.
We are.
Okay. I get it, but...
Thank you, Your Worship.